Now, if you read terror management theorists, the terror management theorists will tell you something like your belief system, which is kind of conceptualized as a system of interrelated abstractions, prevents you from terror of death. Alright, so that's Ernest Becker. That's Ernest Becker's theory. It's a pretty good theory. It was grounded on Freudian presuppositions. And he developed that theory in a book called The Denial of Death, which is also a pretty good book. There's a problem with the basic theory as far as I can tell, though. Well, there's multiple problems. It's not a bad theory, and at certain levels of analysis it's a pretty good theory, but it has serious flaws. The first flaw is your belief system is not merely conceptual. You act it out, and that's really important. And it isn't also not the belief system that protects you. It's the fact that other people have organized a society around you predicated on that belief system, and the society works. Like, it's not a psychological, society isn't a psychological phenomena. You have a representation of it, and the representation in part is a psychological phenomena, but the fact that you can sit here in relative peace, harmony, security, warmth, and light is not a psychological phenomena. It's embedded in the world. So a lot of what protects you from death anxiety isn't a psychological structure that stops you from being afraid. It's an actual structure that stops you from dying. And so both are right, but you can't forget about the most fundamental one, right? The most fundamental one is the most fundamental one, and if events occur, maybe even social conflict, and I perceive that the consequences of that social conflict is not only a disruption of what I believe, but also a disruption of the society that protects and shelters me, then of course I'm going to respond negatively to that, and it's not for merely conceptual reasons. It's because if the substructure of the society is actually destroyed, I'm going to freeze to death in the dark immediately. So we don't want to we don't want to make things more psychological than they actually are. And we have to remember that these structures, the dominance hierarchy, is represented, but it also exists out there in the world, and it's a real thing. You're going from point A to point B, and you're looking at the world through that framework. So that framework also configures your perceptions, and it also configures your emotional responses, and so it's variable. But within the variability, there are constants, and the constants are, you're going somewhere, you come from somewhere, and when you go from one to the other, there's only three things that can happen. Something you want, that's a good thing, that gets you to where you're going, and it validates the theoretical integrity of your perceptual frame. That's an important thing, right? It does two things. You get to where you're going, and it provides evidence that your current model is actually functional. So if you fail, both of those things go into question. One is you're not getting where you want to go, that's a problem, but the worst one is, oh, the whole system that you're using to try to get to where you go also might be wrong, and you don't know where. Is it reasonable to propose that the fundamental cybernetic frame is narrative? And I would say pretty much none of the theorizers, except for maybe Piaget, who have a cybernetic model, have drawn a relationship between narrative and cybernetic models. But here's why. I think if you look at someone like Jeffrey Gray, who is incredibly intelligent and well-educated psychologist, really an outstanding scholar in my estimation, he derived his cybernetic models from Russian cybernetic models that were based on the presupposition that what you do when you move in the world is you compare the current state of the world to the state you expect. And that's wrong. It's wrong in an important way, because you're not an expectancy machine. You're not a cold, cognitive, computational machine. You don't act in the world in accordance with what you expect. You act in the world in accordance with what you want. And that's it's a critical difference. So if you read Gray's, for example, The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, and you get a sense of the cybernetic model that's underneath there, there's never any real mention of motivation per se, except for emotional motivation. There's the approach system and the fear system and the negative emotion system, but motivation as such doesn't seem to enter into it. You know, the fact that entities, animals, are hungry and thirsty, and desirous of sexual contact and playful and all those sorts of things. You can read Jaak Panksepp for better descriptions of those systems, but those things have to be brought together. And my proposition, as soon as you bring them together, is you get narrative, because you're talking about people who are motivated and want things, and then descriptions of the structures that they use to operate in the world to get the things that they want. That's a narrative.